To the Aquarium and to the second class of our Spring Aquatic Academy that deals with the effect of Earth's health on human health. And tonight we are streaming this live, and in the next two classes we will be streaming them live because our speakers in the next two classes aren't able to be with us. We have two brave souls with us tonight doing this in person. And our first speaker for this evening is Jennifer Vanos. And you have her bio in your packet. And you can see that the title of her talk is Hotspots for Resilience, Tackling the Health Challenges of Extreme Heat from Global to Local. And she will be followed then by our second speaker, Miriam. And Miriam Marlier came from not so far away from UCLA, but Jennifer came to us from Arizona State University. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Vanos.
Awesome. Thank you, Jerry. So I'll just wait a minute till my slides pop up here. How's everyone doing? Good. Thank you for being here. You're also very brave. All right, so as we wait, they're coming. I'll be talking all about extreme heat. And I know it doesn't get too hot in Long Beach because you have this nice moderating effect from the ocean. But I'm going to give you some pretty neat examples and takeaways from other hot cities, including Phoenix, where I live right now. And so thinking about resilience and being able to bounce back from an extreme heat event is really important. And I want to give you some of that context in a global setting and local settings, whether it's here in California or some of the work we're doing in the city of Phoenix at ASU. And so a little bit of background on myself first. I'm originally from Canada, not too far from Toronto, but I grew up on a little farm. And then I've spent about 3.5 years in Texas and at Texas Tech University as an assistant professor. I spent almost 2 years in San Diego, just down the beach. And then now I'm at Arizona State University. So I feel like I learned so much along the way just from living in different areas and working with different people and gaining new perspectives on how you might tackle some of these challenges depending on the context or the neighborhood or the city you're working in. And I think one of the main messages with a lot of this is going to be it's not one size fits all, and this solution can't just be plopped into this neighborhood or this city the same way it can be in Long Beach, for example. And so that'll be a theme throughout this. But to get started, this is essentially the outline. But before I get into that, I want to make sure you know how interdisciplinary this work is and the type of people that come together to tackle a lot of these challenges. So I'm in the School of Sustainability at ASU, and I'm surrounded by social scientists and people who do more qualitative or also more quantitative work like me, people who have backgrounds in social justice, or I have my background in atmospheric science and climate. And so it's really fun to be able to work across these disciplines. And then we also work with a lot of different sectors. So we work with the government in the cities or at the state level. We work with public health departments. We work with schools. And so there's a lot of different people involved in tackling these challenges and a lot of really fun collaborations happening. And so I'm going to first get into heat and why it's a hazard. A lot of reasons for why we even care about heat as a hazard. Then I'll go into some specific real-world cases that'll put a personal touch on why this is really important to study now and not wait for 50 years to study it or to do something about it. Adaptation and mitigation and where climate change comes into play. And then moving forward, so what kind of strategies are being implemented now? And one of my goals in this talk, and you can tell me at the end if I do a good job of it, is to make sure that you don't walk away from this feeling sad and depressed and like the world is coming to an end, right? Because that's no fun. I want to point out some of the really good work going on to make true differences at community levels, to help people be able to be resilient when a heat wave comes in, and what they are doing or what they can do about it, and how we're really empowering them to do so. So, first test, question. Can anyone tell me if this is a heat wave in this picture? Why or why not? Well, it is Long Beach. You guys can have heat waves here. Heat wave is location specific. It could be a heat wave. It could be a cold wave. In Phoenix, you can't really tell by looking out the window if it's hot or cold out. There's no snow. In this picture, can you tell me if this is an air pollution day, so a poor air quality day? I don't know. Most pollutants, apart from particulate matter that Miriam's going to talk about from forest fires, are invisible to the human eye when you're at ground level. And so the main point I'm making here is that both heat and air pollution events are invisible to the human eye. We cannot look outside and know for a fact what the temperature is. There might be ways to try to figure that out by looking at your phone app, but just by looking, you can't really tell out your window. And they're also very slow-moving events versus something like a hurricane or a tornado or another storm or a flood that comes in, and you can actually see what's happening and see the impact and see the damage. And so it makes events that are heat and air pollution more invisible, harder to study or harder for people to respond to properly, and they last a lot longer. And oftentimes you might have a really bad heat event, and then you end up with atmospheric inversions causing really poor air quality, or forest fires, which Miriam will talk about. So there's a lot of interrelationships. And so what I study human biometeorology and human bioclimatology. And the main differences between those is that one is really focused on meteorology. So that's looking maybe from hour to hour, day to day, week to week, month to month. And then if I'm studying human bioclimatology, that's really looking at climate timescales. So that means that you're looking at essentially 30 years of data and that change over 30 years in what is happening to human health. And so you can intertwine them a lot, but you might look at on a daily or seasonal scale, you can look at asthma rates or heat stroke or heat deaths. And then you can start to look at the changes that occur along over 30 years of data. And then you can start to see how many more heat waves are we having, how many more days above 110, for example. So that's the difference in how I distinguish between when I'm studying something that's more about meteorology or something that could be related to climate change. Okay. So, extreme heat is a problem now. It's been a problem in the past. It's going to be a problem in the future. And that means that if it's a problem today, we shouldn't wait for 50 years to really start solving it. What I'm showing you here is in Maricopa County. That's where Phoenix is. That's the largest county in the US and also the fastest growing county in the US. And what I'm showing you is the number of heat-related deaths per year in our county. And so on average, about 150 people die due to heat each year. Is that surprising to anyone? Did anyone know that? That is far more than in our country when we look at floods, lightning, or hurricanes, tornadoes combined. And this is just for Maricopa County, and then if you look at across the country, that number goes up. Just this summer, we're looking at our highest number ever with 10 more cases pending. And so this is a problem that's happening, and we also know that we see a lot of hospitalizations, so emergency department visits. And you see that there's a lot of emergency department visits the older you get, if for that age. And so it's really important to understand the way demographics will be changing. So how many more people will fall within different age categories as we go on to understand who's going to be most impacted by extreme heat. And another really important point about emergency department visits is that they cost a lot of money. So for a person to be admitted to the emergency department for a case of exertion or of heat stroke or heat exhaustion, it costs about $5,000. So that's important to know and think about. And then we have productivity and workers being affected on a daily basis, workers changing their schedules, working overnight, having to take more breaks, or getting ill, or facing other health hazards due to working in extreme heat. And so it killed 850 US workers and injured over 70,000 from 1992 through 2017. So that's an important metric as well now as we move forward. And when we think about all of these impacts, we're really looking, with mortality, we're looking at this tip. And with hospital admissions, we're looking at this tip. And then emergency department visits. But when we think about productivity, or someone not being able to go to work, or a student not being able to go to class, or other issues with lowered physical activity, lower performance in class, poor behavior, mental health, those would all come down at the bottom of this and shows that there's a higher proportion of people affected by heat at the bottom of this pyramid. And so it's important to not only look at die or not die, it's important to look at quality of life along that spectrum and understand how extreme heat is truly impacting people's well-being. So the question we often ask ourselves is just, what ways can we better monitor, measure, and understand the impacts so that we can better inform adaptation policies? So adaptation, it just means changes that we can make today to be able to cope better with extreme heat. One of the main examples of that is air conditioning, and we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up, but it's not the only adaptation strategy to combating extreme heat. And so here's another example of how this is a now problem and how we're already adapting. So New York Times came to do a story on Phoenix in the summer, and they spent about 4 days there, and most of their story occurred at night because people just didn't really go out in the day. So we walked around with them a lot at night, and they went to parks at night, and that's when the kids were playing. When the sun went down, people were hiking at 4 a.m., the workers were working overnight. And their story really detailed how Phoenicians have just changed their behavior to deal with the heat. And that's normal, that's just how it is. And as far as I can tell, people are fine with that, but you will have some groups that we'll talk about that are more vulnerable and may not be able to withstand the summer heat if they can't, let's say, pay for their air conditioning. And we know that adaptation will be a key into the future. And then we can look at California, and we can see that, okay, the minimum temperature overnight has been rising. And it's actually, in most cities, the minimum overnight temperature has been rising more than the daytime maximum temperature. And that has a lot to do with the way we build our cities, and the fact that our skyscrapers and our roads and our houses and our driveways, they are all made up of material that can hold more heat, and then slowly it releases at night, and it causes what we call the urban heat island effect, which looks like this. And so your downtown is a little bit warmer than other areas of the city or than the rural parts. And so with those, with that urban heat island effect growing, then we see these higher overnight temperatures. Another reason that we see this is because it's becoming a little bit more humid, especially in some California cities. And so the humidity allows a lot of that heat to stay within the city system, you can say, instead of escaping out to space, just like the greenhouse effect. And so when somebody doesn't have air conditioning and they can't get out of the heat and they have to withstand higher temperatures overnight, then that kind of health effect or the physiological effect of heat can build up. And what we see in epidemiological data is the maximum death rate occurs 3 days after the heat wave began. And so that's important to understand how the buildup of heat affects the body. Okay, so I mentioned the increased urban heat. So our cities are designed in a way that keeps them a little bit warmer, both in the daytime and at the nighttime. We just see that rural to urban difference is greater at night. If you put that rise in temperature on top of a climate change signal, then we have a combined increase in temperature in our cities that people are exposed to. And I say exposed to because if you're going about your everyday life, you could be someone who is exposed to 90 degrees Fahrenheit for a large portion of your day, or you might be exposed to that for maybe 5% of your day if you go from your air-conditioned house to your air-conditioned car to your air-conditioned office to the air-conditioned gym back to your air-conditioned house. then you're not really exposed to that temperature. And so you're not someone we really worry about. We worry about the folks who are not, maybe don't have a full air-conditioned house, or their air conditioner broke, or they're taking public transit and have to walk along very hot, unshaded sidewalks to an unshaded bus stop and get on a hot bus. Those are more of the folks we worry about, or might work outdoors. And so then you see cumulative effects of heat affecting their overall health, and they need more resources to cope with that heat, including water, food, and whatnot. And in general, that population does not have those resources. So it's important to think about these two combined effects, and then what an individual is truly exposed to as they're walking through an urban environment, or driving through, or working in. All right, so I was pretty close colleagues with Katherine Hayhoe at Texas Tech. Has anyone seen her speak before? She's a climate change scientist, and I love it when she asks this question. Why do we actually care about this? So why do we care about increasing extreme heat? And we care about it because it exacerbates some of the risks we already face today. So we are already at risk of dehydration on hot days. And as it's going up, it's increasing a little bit, we get a little bit more at risk of it. And so it's kind of loading the dice against us, you could say. And a lot of climate change issues are like this. It's becoming exacerbated. An issue like hurricanes that we already face is getting a little bit worse. And heat waves are just like that, becoming more intense and more frequent. So now I'm going to bring in these personal stories. I'm going to go back for a minute. Okay. So I want to put a human touch on a lot of this. And every single heat death that occurs, so those 150 on average deaths per year in Phoenix, has a story behind it, and there's a reason that that happened. It's not just random. There's some reason that that happened, and some factor that's not necessarily just the temperature that caused that heat death to occur. So this is a story of Stephanie Pullman. A couple summers ago, she could not pay her bill, and she couldn't pay her full bill. So she couldn't pay about $170 of her bill. She paid the rest. And so the electrical company shut off her electricity, and so she couldn't run her little window air conditioner unit. And her daughters lived in Ohio, and they didn't know this. And Stephanie Pullman ended up dying of classic heat stroke in her apartment. And what her daughter said is, we would have never let her power go out, never. They would have paid that, but Stephanie didn't tell them this happened. So I'll say this again and again, but all heat deaths are preventable. And something like this shouldn't happen. And so one of the changes that's been made across the state of Arizona is that electrical companies are not allowed to turn out someone's electricity during the warm season, which I think in Arizona they're defining as April to October maybe. And so for the last summer season, there's a moratorium on shutoffs. So everyone got to keep their power, everyone got to keep their air conditioning going, but everyone still owes that bill now. And now in the winter, they can still get their electricity shut off if they can't pay that bill. And so you can see that this might be a solution for the summer, but it's not truly helping the people who can't afford that $100 bill. And these are the types of populations we're the most concerned about when a heat wave comes along, or we're concerned about the homeless who don't have shelter from the heat. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. This summer we'll have a moratorium again, but then again in the fall, these same residents will owe a lot of money if they couldn't pay it in the summer. But hopefully, and studies will be done on this, hopefully no one dies of indoor heat deaths. But every year people do die of indoor heat deaths. 43% of the deaths in Phoenix are indoors. Here's another example. Athletes are at increased risk, especially youth athletes. This is an example of a 15-year-old football player over in Kentucky, I believe, and he died of exertional heat illness. So that's different from classic heat illness like Stephanie. He was exerting himself on the football field in a lot of equipment under pretty hot conditions. Again, it was preventable. And it pounces on the young and fit. And that's not something you see classical heat stroke pounce on. So classic heat stroke is more of a worry with people who are sick and older. Exertional heat stroke happens in more young and fit individuals. But it's important to think about what caused this. And in this case, the football coach was essentially running a practice that you run until someone stops. And no one stopped until Max had to get brought to the hospital. The other thing they learned after the fact was that he was taking Adderall and also another drug. So I think, and creatine. So when we think about this situation, we want to look at what factors in that environment or in his situation were modifiable, and which factors were not modifiable, but these ones are what's intrinsic to him. So Max would have been a pretty fit person. He was probably heat acclimatized because it didn't happen directly at the start of the season, but most of the illness and deaths do happen right at the start of the season. But you would hope now they're supposed to be heat acclimatized. They had a really high exercise intensity. He was taking supplements. I believe in a lot of the stories you read after in the court case on this, they were not provided good enough hydration. And then there's other things you can't change. So is body size and type and other predisposing medical conditions. But in the end, again, this was a preventable case, and all football cases are preventable. So now for more, hopefully, good news, the cases of heat deaths in football players has been going down in the US a little bit. If you look at the past to today, on average, over the last 5 years or so, there's about 2.2 deaths per year in football players. So it's still not okay that people are dying of exertional heat stroke. Oftentimes there is some predisposing issues and complications that's going on. But if you also look at the geography of it, what do you notice? Where are they concentrated? More in the east, especially southeast. And that's important to know. And in the east and southeast, unlike here, it's a lot more humid. And that humidity can essentially stop your ability to evaporate sweat from your body. And when you can't evaporate and the air temperature is really hot, you have essentially shut down every mechanism of losing heat from your body. And then your inner core starts to go up. And as you add physical activity to that and metabolic intensity, it can go up even higher. And that's where exertional heat stroke becomes an issue. So, and I wanted to say too, Georgia did have quite a few deaths in the past, and they've since implemented strategies where they monitor on-site and have cooling tubs on-site and have not seen a death since then, which is great. So I work with Corey Stringer Institute. Corey Stringer was an American NFL football player on the Minnesota Vikings who died of exertional heat illness in practice one year. And the KSI was started from that, and they do a lot of advocacy and education and outreach, essentially showing that if the athletic trainer is properly trained on how you deal with exertional heat illness on the field, how you monitor the environment properly, how you would treat an athlete that may be suffering from this, then every case is 100% survivable, and you wouldn't have other impacts to their life afterwards, because you can have impacts after dealing with heat stroke. You can have seizures and other organ injuries. And so the map didn't really show up well. So that's the USA. So you can see, to orient you, Georgia's right here. So what this is showing is that there are certain states that will use on-site monitoring now, or on-site cooling, or both. So the best way to save someone's life that is going into exertional heat stroke with a higher core temperature is to plop them in an ice tub. And you cool first, transport second. That's a really important factor to include, and slowly states and high school districts are coming on board with these preventative measures. And if you do have these preventative measures in place, it will save someone's life. So I think the main message here is that good things are happening to try to adapt to these extremes and still allow athletes to be able to do things. But again, that on-site monitoring, so you know on that field, that soccer field or that football field, how hot it truly is. And then you make modifications to the clothing, to the practice, to the number of breaks you get from that. And if you implement that, then you should be fine. Some days you just have to cancel practice. And sometimes coaches aren't okay with that, but it's for the protection of their athletes, and I think that that's the most important part here. Another example is just school children. And so a recent study that was done by an undergrad student at ASU talked to teachers in a school district in Phoenix and just asked them questions about how kids at their school were dealing with the heat. We got a lot of responses like this. After they go outside for lunch recess, they are wilted flowers, or it's just too hot to play. And we don't want to see that. We don't want to live in a place or design our spaces that can't be used for what they're supposed to be there for. So I do a lot of research on trying to create more playable spaces for kids, and that includes being able to use more vegetation for shade or for evaporative cooling, or use shade sails, provide water fountains out there. There's a lot of ways that you can cool off a playground and make it into more of a park cooling island versus something like a hotter area. So if you've ever been to a park that has the rubber and the really hot slides with no shade, you can easily burn yourself. And a lot of our preliminary work in Phoenix on this looked at just that. How likely would it be that a child would go down the slide and get first or second degree burn and have to go to the hospital for that? And if it is like that, that means you can't use that space. And we don't want to have spaces that are unusable for a large proportion of the year. And this isn't just a Phoenix problem. When I was in San Diego, we found the same thing. It's really important to be able to shade surfaces that skin is going to be touching in any area. So one highlighted example of what we're trying to do and push forward, and this is a study in Canada, with Health Canada and the Standards Council of Canada, is starting to incorporate extreme heat considerations and a change in climate in these Canadian cities, so that the way playground designers are thinking about spaces and designing spaces is taking heat into account, as well as other environmental factors. So you can think about it the same way in the winter we want to take wind into account, so that we can extend the period that these spaces are available to be played in. And that's an example of adaptation to extremes. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question again and remind you that we care about increasing extreme heats because it increases the many health issues that we already face. And so this is a weather and climate schematic that my colleague Catherine Hayhoe developed at Texas Tech, and it's super simple, but I think it's really a good way to show what's happening. So we know that our society is and the way we prepare for extremes, and an extreme could be this tip here, a hot extreme or a cold extreme or a flood or a drought. The way we prepare for that is just based on this simple assumption that the climate is stable and that long-term averages will even out. And we know that that's not the case based on the data. And we know that it looks more like this, that we have a tilt and we're seeing rising temperatures. And so just the fact that we see this higher average temperature is going to make it more likely that we see heat waves. And so essentially loading the dice against us again. But we also see that variability. So did you guys see that? It got more variable. So I'll go back. It's spread out. So the extremes are getting more extreme, especially on the high end. So with heat, we see more heat records broken than cold records broken. And that's really important to understand too. And so where I really am interested in my work on extreme heat is that tip, and how much higher is it, and how much worse can those days be for the people who don't truly have the means to cope with climate or with the heat, or what can we do to help them working at that level. So one other important area or important question that comes up is, well, wasn't that caused by climate change? Was that heat wave caused by climate change? Was that hurricane caused by climate change? And the answer is usually no. Climate change didn't cause it, but it exacerbated its intensity, you could say. But it's really hard to try and attribute climate change or attribute heat deaths, let's say, to that climate change signal. So there are a lot of scientists that look at climate or attribution. And so essentially we want to determine whether or how much of a certain outcome, in my case, a health outcome, so number of deaths, could be attributed to climate change. And a way of trying to figure that out is by saying, all right, well, if the temperature did stay stable and straight, what would we have guessed that number of deaths to be? But now with this rise, what is it? And if you look at that difference, then you can try and figure out what that attribution is, or fingerprint. So again, with this squiggly line, it might look like this, but then we add in more extremes, and then we want to see what's going on at those tips. What is the potential attribution due to climate change? And that is hard to study and answer, but I think that is a lot of times the question we get from a health, or also economists are studying this as well, trying to see, well, how much more costly was Hurricane Harvey due to the fact that the waters were warmer and so a lot more rain got dumped in the city of Houston? And so it's also an interesting area to study, an important area to study. But with all of that in place, adaptation is really important. It's not a new thing. Humans have been adapting all our lives to changing environments, migrating to new places where we can grow better crops, moving to a place with better water resources. But when we look at what the IPCC shows as, or states as, adaptation to climate change, we have 4 types. We have technological, infrastructural, behavioral, and physiological. So I've talked a little bit about behavioral in Phoenix, saying that everyone kind of stays inside in the day and comes outside at night. Technological, you might think about air conditioning as one of those, or heat warning systems. So, or even your phone can now warn you when a heat wave is coming in, or a dust storm is coming in, or a hurricane is coming in. Those are all types of technological adaptations that try to change your behavior. And then physiological. So every year as it goes into the summer or winter, your body is going to go through some type of physiological adaptation so that you can better withstand heat or cold. Here in Long Beach, it's not as fluctuating as maybe, let's say, in New York or Detroit, who deal with really cold, and really hot. So you would see a greater physiological change, but it's no different than thinking about the athletes that are preparing for Tokyo. And what they need to prepare for in Tokyo is really high temperatures and really high humidity, which the way they're practicing for that is by forcing themselves to be exposed to those conditions so that their body knows it. And then if they're acclimatized to that, they should perform better. And so every athlete knows that they're going to be experiencing that, and the best way you can cope with physiologically with the heat is by allowing your body to learn essentially how to do that, and by being healthy and fit yourself. So essentially when we go through a lot of these strategies, we want to observe and learn, plan, act, and then we want to adjust to that and evaluate if that system works. So we can evaluate if our heat warning systems are working. And we can work with cities at city level to do this, or with neighborhoods at neighborhood level to do this. So then moving forward, what are some of these, I want to show you one more thing. So another, I think, important positive takeaway is that we've been seeing in developed countries heat-related mortality to be decreasing. So if we look at the numbers, we know that heat-related mortality is going down, and this is in countries like USA, Canada, European countries, Australia, South Korea. Every single study shows a downward trend in heat-related mortality. However, and this is from a paper we published in 2015, a systematic review. If you look at what's projected into the future, all of the projections are showing that heat-related mortality is going to skyrocket. And of course, this is really hard to project. You're putting climate models with uncertainty on top of demographics, so we know the population is getting older, and so we know that that will end up increasing heat-related mortality. But there's so many other considerations to take into account. So thinking about all those adaptation strategies, we need to make sure that what we have been doing in the past to adapt to changing heat levels, so even though the temperature is rising, our heat-related mortality is going down, so that's great. What have we been doing right? So that we can really include those factors in the models going forward, and maybe we can get this line to be a little bit shallower. But in essence, we know that there's certain factors, such as climate change, urban population, or aging population, urban heat, that will result in riskier situations for people. But this is what we see historically, and it's important to know why we see this as historically, if we can keep going lower, and also know that there's variability from year to year, and it might depend on what kind of social net are going to catch the homeless in Phoenix. How many homeless do we have on the streets? And if it's lower one year, maybe we'll see a lower dip. If it's higher another year, maybe we'll see a higher rise. And it's important to understand that and then figure out ways that we can protect lives during these extremes. And so what are other reasons? So we talked about air conditioning. The heat health warning systems are important to consider. Other interventions, education, and other health systems. So overall, our public health systems have gotten better, and so that can be helping people also stay safer in the heat. So moving forward from that, then, we can think about what types of mitigation and adaptation strategies are being used. So again, we're looking at this image where we had the urban heat island, but then we see we can create park cooling islands using green or blue infrastructure, so essentially vegetation or water. And that can lower temperatures and allow people to escape the heat but still get outside. This is an example of a playground in San Diego that I worked in, and we're looking at artificial turf here. And you can see how much hotter the artificial turf gets. So in Celsius, so 67 degrees Celsius, I believe is around 160 Fahrenheit. Someone can check that math if you want. And so kids won't want to be playing on that. And we see even higher temperatures on rubber in playgrounds or on slides. And then we can see in this picture too, what a beautiful influence this tree has on the cooling of the surfaces and essentially bringing that environment to a more comfortable space. And the kids tended to hang out under that tree a lot, which unfortunately meant that they weren't getting as much physical activity because outside in the sun it was just too hot. And I think that's an important factor to consider, is how much physical activity are kids able to get, and can we build spaces that they can still move? Even in this situation, this was in October in San Diego, in El Cajon, and we don't want to be saying to kids it's too hot to play in October. So we want to think about ways that we can adapt spaces to make them cooler, safer too. And even with that, if you look at it, block the UV radiation so they're not getting sunburns. And a lot of our research looks at that as well. Here's a really good example of giving people agency and the ability to change their environment and work with nonprofits. So we have a nonprofit in Phoenix called Trees Matter. And the city of Phoenix has been really putting in new heat initiatives and a lot of efforts forward to mitigate heat in the city. And so just planting trees is one way to do that, but it's also educating people on how to do that and how to care for the trees so that they don't die in the first year of life, which happens a lot. And so these educational plans are really important. And then the city of Tempe and city of Phoenix have these tree and shade master plans. And LA has tree and shade plans as well, and also has similar situations where there's just a lack of shade along a lot of the streets because trees can't go somewhere because of hydro lines or electricity lines, for example, or there's water lines in the ground. And so these are all lessons that we've gotten to learn from working side by side with people at the city. And then figuring out, okay, where can we put trees? What types of trees should we put in? Which ones are going to provide the most shade but not use too much water? Because of course water is a big factor in all of this. Another way to get input from the cities and the neighborhoods is to host events with them and ask them how they perceive their environment. So we've done 2 heat walks, one in Phoenix and one in Tempe, and we've just walked around the neighborhood with kids and neighborhood members and asking them questions, giving them an ability to measure surface temperatures, to measure air temperatures. You can see in this one we have this meteorological cart behind them that's telling us all about the different radiative exchanges in the environment. And so then we can take that data and pair it with what people told us and figure out what areas can we improve the most. Where do we need to invest funds at the city level so that people can get places by walking versus getting in their car to get to the park that's pretty near close by. And a lot of times people do drive just because it's too hot to walk. And we want to make sure that we're providing right-of-ways and corridors that they can safely walk in. So same thing, and these are part of our climate action plan at the city level, and we did a lot of work on looking at how we can build resilience against extreme heat in the city and put together this report for the city looking at parks and play spaces, multi-use paths, arterial walls, and parking lots. And then the city is taking a lot of our data and incorporating it into their future plans. And so it's really important to be able to take data and create evidence with it that can be used for change and for action. So we really focus on walkability and usability and playability of spaces. So just a couple more of these examples that we created for them. Another really good example that was able to spread education and give agency to some groups was a study we did in El Paso, Texas. So this is right on the border of US and Mexico. So you have El Paso and then Juarez. And community health workers are called promotoras. And so they'll work and they will go to different houses in colonias, which are essentially unincorporated low-income places along the border, sometimes without working water or electricity. And they will take information to the residents, and they're very well trusted by the residents. And so we were able to work with them to create training on extreme heat and health in their region and how they can protect themselves and others from extreme heat and high temperatures. And so we created this in English and Spanish, and we did 8 modules guided by focus groups, 30 promotoras, took the training, and then did pre and post educational home visits with their clientele. And then we're able to give them credits and have the curriculum accredited in Texas. So it was really amazing to see all of this happen. I did a lot of sitting around not being able to understand at all what they were saying, but all the training, of course, was in Spanish. And they all got their own certificate as part of this program. It was just such a neat experience. And the other things that we gave them, and they gave us really great feedback on these so that we could make them as best as we could, were these handouts. So how to beat the heat in English and Spanish, P charts, which show if you're dehydrated, and the community health workers that worked more with pregnant mothers and outdoor workers found that these were the most popular among the people they spoke with and made the biggest difference. So that was really neat to see. And this is just what the Army would use out in the field so that their soldiers know if they're dehydrated. We gave them little thermometers, and we also worked with a lot of people who will have pregnant women clientele. So that's another example. I'm going to finish on a sad note, but I have to talk about it. People have heard about pediatric heat stroke in vehicles? Yeah, it's a big problem. I think this is another example of a now problem, and this is not a climate change problem at all. This is a people problem, and it's something that also should never happen. And when you see a number like 849 people, or infants, have died of extreme heat since 1998. All of those are preventable, but it's happening. And over half of those are just due to being forgotten, a child being forgotten in the car. And so you can see that this year we're at 52, and that's almost the highest. Last year, 53 was the highest. And one of the reasons I'm putting this up there is because March 20th is on average the first day of a pediatric heat stroke death, and that's only in 9 days. And so in California, it happens. Be aware. If you see a kid in a car, call 911. There are Good Samaritan laws where you can call 911 and they will say, yeah, break the window, get them out of there. Some states even have it for dogs. You can truly save a life this way, and it's a very, very, very sad situation because most of the time it's just being forgotten in the car and it's unintentional. Some situations are a kid gains access to a car and accidentally locks themselves in there and the parent can't find them. And so that's also an example of like not leaving your keys out. But there are now, for the first time I just saw this, there's training videos from the NCS to train people on ways that you can be more aware of not like your memory essentially. So the same way you can forget your keys, you can forget your child in a car. However, you are more aware of your child being there, so you don't do that very often. I think it's really important to just do little tasks like put your purse in the back, put your shoes in the back, so that you always have to grab something from the back, because this was not an issue before airbags got put in the front and kids had to go in the back before 1998. And so that means that it's out of sight, out of mind issue, and a very sad one, and it can happen to anyone. And the worst thing you can do is assume it can't happen to you. And you can go online and find these really, really sad stories of parents who are the best parents in the world, and this happened to them. It'll break your heart, but it's really important to be aware of this, whether you have a child or not, that if you see something like this, do something about it. Opening a window doesn't really help much. Being in the shade doesn't really help much. We've done studies on that. So just being aware of that. So finishing on that sad note, but in the end, what I want to say is that we know there's current and future extreme heats that threaten life in general, that people die unnecessarily, that it affects our health and well-being, that vulnerable populations are at the highest risk, and that it affects economic viability, such as the ability to work outdoors, and that this is all a now problem, it's not a future problem, and so acting on it now is important, rather than waiting until we see whether we're going to hit a 2-degree increase in 1950, let's say. So I think it's really important, I want to leave you with that it's now a problem, let's act on it now, and that all of these deaths can be prevented. So with that, I will thank you.
So, Jennifer, you've worked now in several universities in several cities. Is the degree of involvement of ASU in Phoenix greater than in the other universities and cities you've been in?
Yeah, I think I've been at ASU for about 1.5 years now, and in ASU's charter, it says that we will make sure that the work we do essentially benefits the community around us, and that we work hand in hand, essentially. And so we actually have this, within our school, we have what we call social embeddedness. So when we're trying to do research with communities, making sure that they're benefiting from the research and that we're not just extracting data from low-income communities, which unfortunately happens all too often. And so that we're able to be supported to set up long-term trusting situations. And so I'm doing a lot of work in South Phoenix, which has in the past been not as trusted or not as trusting of bigger institutions because of historic redlining, or just kind of having decisions made for them about their neighborhoods and life. And now I think that just being able to, that my dean will support me to do more socially embedded research is important, and I have never been told that before at previous universities, or I have never felt this connection to the community the way I do at ASU.
I think it is unusual. I spent a lot of years in the university, and the three-legged stool is research, education, and public service. But the legs of the stool are not of equal length.
Right.
And in most of them, the service leg is pretty short. Who has a question? Yes, Francis? We're going to need to get you a microphone, Francis, just a second. So while Linda's taking that microphone up, given not the now data, but the future data,
Yeah.
do you ever think about it would be nice to go back to Toronto?
Well, I don't like the snow.
Yeah, but it's going to get warmer all the time there.
Yeah. They do like the urban heat effect in the winter in Toronto. I really like the fact that I can live in a place and essentially have a lab in my backyard to study extreme heat.
Right.
It's really neat to do that.
It is.
And I haven't been able to, in Texas I could a little bit, but it still got pretty cold in the winter. But in Phoenix you have a good 6 months or 5 months of the year where you can start studying extreme heat. And the efforts that public health puts into understanding heat and doing the mortality counts right, they're really leading the way for the rest of the country to be able to use some of these methods in a more standardized fashion, and that's exciting to me. I really don't like snow, so I don't think, unless I'm like kicked back to Canada, I think I'm staying for a little bit.
If any of you aren't familiar with the story of Arizona State University, it's quite a remarkable story because the president there, Michael Crow, used to be the provost at Columbia. He moved to Arizona State, and he wanted to create a different kind of a type 1 research university and more interdisciplinary, and it's now the largest university in the country.
Yeah.
With over 100,000, and then more than how many are online?
So I think we have over 70,000 in person, and then if you add the online, it's about 101,000 students now. And it's very inclusive, so we have a similar demographic of our state and make sure that anyone that truly wants an education can get it. And that cost shouldn't be a barrier.
All right, Francis, go ahead.
Your lecture information is absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you. It brought some matters to my attention of great concern. Long Beach has a planning commission, and they're now planned to have, I know, 3 structures. 2, it's going to be 50 stories. 1 on Long Beach Boulevard, and 3rd is going to be 27 stories. So I was thinking about adaptive policies and how the higher buildings have increased urban heat. Would it be helpful to have like gardens on the top of the buildings and maybe swimming pools? And my thing more than anything is where you're at, okay, there's a planning commission in Long Beach. Do they have something similar to that where you actually go to the planning commission? Do they have a person on the board? Because I think looking at what's going on, I think it needs to be done in every city, that your expertise is brought to the city where they won't sit on it. And because we've got young people here, and we got to really look at making the difference before we have a catastrophic situation of not just older adults dying, but actually young children and also young people. Thank you.
That's a great question. First, I think so with the city, we work very closely with the sustainability officer for the city on a lot of these initiatives, including the Climate Action Plan, which its 2 main goals right now are decreasing greenhouse gas emissions in the city and extreme heat, and protecting people's lives from extreme heat. Working with him, he is our conduit, I think, between the right people to talk to. So if I need to talk to the parks people about my data and share it with them, we'll be able to get meetings set up to really put that into place. I don't know if it's the same type of planning commission, but I think that essentially we make sure that we talk to the right people, but in the end, it's going to go and be decided higher up and voted on. And I think that the sustainability officer is the way we get to that. And every city actually doesn't have a sustainability officer. It's a bit of a new position, and some cities have that and some cities do not.
And we do here.
You do?
Yes.
That's great. And so your other question about these high-rise buildings, I didn't include infrastructural heat mitigation techniques, which can include something like a green roof or a white roof. One of my colleagues in the Urban Climate Research Center at ASU, Dave Saylor, works on what we call supercooled roofs. And it's this special material that essentially ensures that a lot of the heat is reflected or emitted in a wavelength that's not going to essentially heat up the atmosphere. And being able to put these supercooled facades onto buildings, essentially, it will help keep the buildings cool, or essentially you would have to use less energy to cool it off and then let that heat escape. And then, I mean, green roofs are helpful. It creates spaces that people can also use. But the other thing you made me thought of, and I want to be clear, tall buildings aren't bad per se. They provide shade, right, which is really nice in the summer. It depends, though, how you orient them. And if you're orienting them so that they are like blocking the south or whatever time of day sun you want to block, that's one strategy. And then, of course, the material on the outside, another strategy for it not retaining heat. And then in Tempe, they just passed this policy, essentially, that says that if they're going to build more apartments or condos, they either have to make sure that it's accessible, I think, to low income, or that they're using heat mitigation strategies around the building, one or the other. So it's this adaptive type of policy that they have to do one or the other to make, if they want to build in our city now. Yeah.
Let's take another one down. Did somebody have a hand up down here?
Greetings. I have heard from the recent projections, I believe, that if we reach like the year 2030, and I think it's 4 degrees centigrade rise, we're going to find a lot of effects from climate change hitting, and it'll get more and more extreme. From your research or from others that are working on this, is there like a kind of a temperature rise that you would foresee that would be really detrimental to human health? You see a lot of change in the incidence of illness, the mortality rate would really maybe skyrocket over. I mean, what level of heat rise globally or even locally or regionally would that be, if you know?
That is like the golden question, right? If we could only know what that means. Globally, that's really hard to say because cities are so different, and certain cities could benefit from that rise and have more time in the year to grow crops, let's say. But overall, we know that the net effect is pretty negative for the globe. But there's really no magic number that's necessarily going to say, like, at this degree centigrade increase, we're going to see X, Y, and Z. We can project that as best as we can, but we know that there's uncertainty in those projections. We do know what's been happening in the past, and that we can try to, if we can model what's been happening in the past, to make sure that the models are working to do that, and then project into the future. But it's really tough to take that and then figure out what's going to happen to people. People are very complicated in understanding their behavior and their health, and even think about what's going on now with the coronavirus. How do you model that kind of perturbation in the system? It's tough. And I wish I had an answer to your question. I don't know if anyone has an answer to your question. But we do know it's rising. We do know it's causing more extremes and exacerbating issues we already face, and that we can do something about it now. But that adaptation has to go hand in hand with mitigation. And so with the temperatures rising, we know they're going to continue rising with the greenhouse gases that have already been put in the atmosphere. So what can we do to adapt to these extremes that we're currently experiencing or planning to experience more of?
But the IPCC, as you well know, they set the aspirational global increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius above. And then the one, though, they were worried most about was 2 degrees Celsius. And there was a consensus that above 2 degrees Celsius, on the average globally, we would begin to see lots of harmful effects. That doesn't mean that some cities wouldn't benefit. Toronto will be a place to go.
Right, because you won't have to use as much heating in the winter.
We're gonna
we're kind of the choir that you're preaching to, in the sense that I speak for all of my dear close friends here, we all pretty much agree with your premises. But I deal with a lot of people that don't share the view that climate change is real. And so what can we do in our daily lives other than talk to our echo chamber? What can we do to make a difference?
So I think that my experience living in a very conservative Texas town has allowed me to probably have an answer for you, and that's not make it about climate change necessarily. It's important to have the discussions about climate change, but if you're talking to someone who you know is going to close their ears when you say that word, then talk about the impacts of heat on kids now or in the past. Or because heat was killing people before climate change was a thing. Air pollution was also. And so if you make it about the now and not about what's potentially going to affect us in 50 years, and make it about something that they care about. So they have a grandchild in a school next to a busy roadway with no shade. If you make it about that and not about climate change per se, but about the situation that exists on its own, then they might start to care more about these environmental issues. And that's what they are. And they were issues before climate change was being studied. And that's how I would approach it. And then after a while, you might be able to start the climate change conversation. But I think a lot of times people will back away from that. But there are still so many important environmental topics that you can talk about with anybody and make it important to them without having to put a climate change lens on it, if that helps.
So we have to close this segment off, but I would just say we may be speaking to the choir, but more of us need to do what Francis does and take this song to the city council, because in many ways, California and Long Beach, we're leaders, but we're also laggards, and there's a lot of good advice in these talks that we should be accelerating what we're doing here. All right, thanks again.
Thank you.
That was a great, great talk.
Thank you, everyone.
And our next speaker, you see her up there, the title, Miriam Marlier. She's at UCLA, and she's going to talk about wildfires, climate, and health, connecting land use with regional public health impacts. Please join me in welcoming Miriam Marlier.
Well, thank you for having me here tonight. I appreciate everyone taking time out of your Wednesday evening to be a part of this course. You know, when we're looking at the topic of the Aquatic Academy for this spring, I really think that wildfires are an excellent example of how the Earth's health is affecting human health. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is this intersection between decisions that people make, climate change, and wildfires, and how that's feeding back and affecting public health. And I know with all the rain that we've been having here in Southern California this week, wildfires may be not quite at the forefront of your mind, but summer and fall, when we traditionally have our wildfire season here, is not too far off. So I hope that I can provide a little bit of insight into what's driving wildfires and how this impacts our health. So I want to start with an overview of some of the major fire events that occurred just this past year. So starting at the upper left, we have an example in Australia. You probably were following some of this in the news. More than 30 people died, thousands of homes were destroyed, and 16 million hectares burned. This is around 8 times higher than the wildfire burned area in California's extreme wildfire year in 2018. You may have also seen news reports about how many native animals were killed by these wildfires, and that's not to mention the natural habitats that were destroyed. So as plant and animal species try to recover, what habitat are they going to be able to go back to? If we move over to the right, I have some examples of fires in 2019 that occurred in Indonesia and in the Amazon rainforest. So in tropical countries, fires are often set as part of the deforestation process to clear land for agriculture, but they can often burn out of control, and this can cause fire events to have a much larger impact than was initially intended. And finally, going back to the bottom left, an example close to us here in Los Angeles. This is from the Getty Fire just this past fall. So this threatened communities across Western LA. Now, fire patterns have been changing pretty rapidly over the past few decades. This map is showing us where fires occur around the world and how they've been changing. So by analyzing fire seasons, and we learned a little bit about this in the previous talk, thinking about temperature, extreme temperature, but also dry conditions. What this study found is that there have been longer fire seasons over a quarter of vegetated areas around the Earth's surface. Now, if you add this up, the study looked over a 35-year period. This means that in some parts of the world, there are areas where the fire season is now a month longer than it used to be. And what this plot is showing, I've also have some highlights in red. We see the western US, so that's relevant for us here in Los Angeles, but also the Amazon and East Africa. These are showing up as areas that have experienced a lot of change in their fire seasons. But we can't just focus on climate conditions. Fire patterns are also driven by multiple interacting factors. This includes climate, but also fuel loads, so what is burning, and land use. And by land use, I mean human activities. So how are people interacting with the Earth's surface? Now, this is another way to conceptualize these relationships and thinking about how fires interact with both human and natural systems. So let's start on the bottom left, and we can think about how people provide ignition sources for fires. And this can be intentional, like clearing the rainforest for agriculture, but it can also be unintentional, when a spark from a campfire ignites a wildfire across broad swaths of land. When we're thinking about human activities, we also think about suppression. So this considers how people have changed natural fire regimes. You may have heard some of this debate here in the western US with Smokey the Bear. So we have a legacy of decades of fire suppression, and now we're starting to realize that by blocking low-level periodic burns, we're having more catastrophic wildfire events when they do occur. Moving to the bottom right, we think about fuel loads and our vegetation type. So put simply, fuel loads is the amount of material that is available to burn. If you're burning a forest, you'll have higher fuel loads and potentially more emissions. If you're burning grasslands, there's less fuel there, so you're going to have lower emissions. So this is something to keep in mind as we move into thinking about how wildfires influence air pollution in public health. But there are also elements of natural fire regimes, as I mentioned earlier, and these will interact with suppression activities. And that really gets at this critical component of considering not just these different components in isolation, but how they all interact together. And finally, let's finish with the top, thinking about climate. So as we saw in the last slide, fire seasons are defined by changing meteorology that's conducive for fires. Again, think hot and dry. But there are also long-term climatic trends, and this is changing how severe fires are and how frequent these conditions are. So now we're going to turn to the focus of this course, which is thinking about how fires impact public health. And there are two broad categories that we can think about. First are local impacts, and this can be on the communities who live close by to the fires, and of course our first responders who are really at the front line. But what we're going to think about today are these regional scale impacts through the contribution of wildfires to air pollution. We see here an example from a satellite image that was taken with the fires in Australia that just occurred. And you see just how much smoke was produced from these wildfire events. There are smoke plumes across most of the coast of southeastern Australia. So our learning objectives today, I'm going to cover three main topics. First, what is driving fire activity around the globe? We're going to think about regionally, where are the variations, and also temporally, how are things changing over time? Second, how do fires impact human health? While there are these important local issues for communities close to the fires, we're going to be taking a broader regional perspective and thinking about what this means, not just for people who live close to where fires occur, but people across the region as a whole. And finally, to end on a more positive note, what can we do about this? How can we both reduce fires and our risk of fires from occurring in the future? And if they are to occur, what can we do to protect the health in our communities? And so our outline today, I'm going to start with a relatively brief survey of wildfire activity around the world, and I'll share some information with how we're measuring these changes. We use a lot of satellites and modeling techniques in order to get a truly global picture about wildfire activity. Second, we'll get into how wildfires influence air pollution. Some of you may be familiar with the negative health outcomes from air pollution, but what I really want you to take home is how wildfires can be a source of this pollution that we may think of more from an urban context instead. Third, we're going to go all the way to Indonesia, and I have a short case study that I wanted to present as an application for how these abstract ideas about wildfires and air pollution, how they really come into practice when we think about a part of the world that is struggling with wildfires, just as we are here in Southern California. And then we'll wrap up with some conclusions and bringing things home to the situation in our state here. So to get started with some thinking about global patterns in fire activity. This is supposed to be a movie if they are able to get it to play. I'll give it a second. If not, oh. I can just describe it as best I can. So this is showing satellite fire active detection. So we have satellites that are observing the Earth, and what they look at are for changes in the thermal signature on the Earth's surface, and they use this to detect fires. So the reason I wanted to show this movie, it was giving us a picture from the beginning of 2000 to just a couple of years ago, and every month showing satellite fire detections around the globe and how these patterns are changing over time. So as the seasons change, what you can see are hotspots of fire activity lighting up around the globe. So, oh, okay. Okay, here we go. So we have, perfect. So this, so it's working on my screen, but not up here. So let's just move on. Okay. Well, in the meantime, I would encourage everyone to go onto the NASA website where they have fantastic visualizations of what satellites are measuring. And so you can see what kind of information we're able to get from satellites. And I think what's really helpful about this is we do see some of these hot spots in wildfire activity. We have, it'll be back. Okay. Well, in the meantime, are there any questions on what I have covered so far? Okay, we're back. Any questions? Okay, so I have another video that I'm not even going to try to play. I can send a link out later if people are interested. This was a video from NASA that I really liked because it talked about the intersection of different drivers of fire activity. So it gives an overview of how NASA scientists and academic researchers and folks from around the world are using really innovative tools, so satellites, modeling, field visits, to try to quantify the factors contributing to wildfires so that we can then understand the impacts on public health. So this is really important to think about how we measure these conditions now. so that we can start to prepare for the future and understand how things are changing. So I'll be happy to provide some of these links for these videos. I apologize that they weren't able to pull them up. So there are a few different ways that we can measure the impact of fires. I have two maps up here that are showing different aspects of wildfire activity. So on the top, first we can think about burned area. And this is the spatial extent of wildfire burning on the ground. And in this top map, we see that the highest incidence of wildfire activity is in Central and Southern Africa. And this is where we have year-to-year agricultural burning and grassland or savanna burning that occurs with pretty strong regular cycle. But second, looking at the bottom, we can also think about emissions. So emissions you can think of as the smoke coming from a fire. And they're going to depend not just on burning conditions, but also on the type of fuel, as I mentioned before. So higher fuel loads will be in forests, and these are going to have more emissions than if grasslands burn. So if you compare these two maps, you're going to see different patterns depending on which quantity that we're looking at. And another thing I want to highlight is that while these past maps were showing averages over the past few decades, there is also long-term variability that has been linked to climate change. Climate change is increasing wildfire activity in many parts of the world, but it's not a consistent increase in every location. In the western US, which is the example for this time series that I have here, wildfire burned area has doubled due to climate change. What the researchers for this study did is they looked at observations of wildfire activity, and then they developed a model that could replicate what we observed. And if they took out the influence of climate change, they found that the wildfire area would have dropped to that yellow bar. But we can't just think about long-term trends. There is also significant variability from year to year. And this is because fire seasons depend on weather conditions, not just long-term climate conditions. These plots are showing the total burned area across the US for the past 30 years. So as you can see from this variability, it becomes challenging to plan for wildfire seasons because it's not a continuous increase or a continuous decrease. There's a lot of variability on a baseline change. And on the climate and meteorology side, one of the biggest drivers of fire activity is the El Nino cycle, which you may have heard about because it impacts our weather here in Southern California. El Nino is tied to different patterns and droughts around the world, and then these have been linked to wildfires. Now, some fires occur naturally in ecosystems, and that is particularly the case here in California. We have some types of forests and shrublands that have naturally co-evolved with fire, and periodic burning is part of how they regenerate and how dead fuel litter gets cleared out. But a big question right now is that if people are changing historical fire regimes, these ecosystems may not be able to keep up, and other vegetation types could take over and change fire regimes into the future. The figure on the right is showing how some Native American tribes use low and medium intensity burning to reduce fuel loads and therefore the risk of catastrophic wildfires. And some communities are working to build on this knowledge to develop new partnerships and new strategies for prescribed burning in order to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. But there are other parts of the world where fire is not a natural part of the ecosystem. I have here an example of a satellite image taken from the Amazon in the 1980s. The color is a little off, but green means it's vegetation. The red pinkish color means that it's something that's been cleared, and blue is water. So I want you to compare the 1980s to just a couple of years ago. And so we can look back and forth at just how widespread this deforestation has been. And while some deforestation occurs without fire, in tropical countries, often wildfires is a big part of the clearing process. And in rainforests, fire is not a natural part of the ecosystem. And so these trees are not adapted to burning. And then another impact can also be that for the remaining areas, the tree canopy has started to be opened up. So then the trees that are left, they are experiencing hotter and drier conditions, and so they're more susceptible to fires occurring in the future, and it becomes this feedback loop. So to wrap up with the first section of my talk, there are 3 different factors that we think about for driving global fire activity. We think about people, climate, and fuels. So wildfires occur around the world, but we need to consider the different variations in various regions as well as over time. And this is both long-term trends and from year to year in individual fire seasons. Climate change has been found this is a source of active research, but we've already found it to be altering the dynamics of our fire seasons, and projections show that this could become more of an issue in the future. And some fires are natural. They could be started by lightning, but others are directly lit by people. And so we need to consider how humans are interacting with their natural environment when we are thinking about wildfire activity. So with that, I am now going to move to the second piece of the course tonight, and we're going to think about that intersection of fires and human health. Now to start, I want to give a little bit of background on air pollution in general before thinking about how wildfires contribute to pollution. So I'm not sure how many folks are aware of this, but air pollution is the 5th highest ranking mortality risk factor around the world. It's responsible for more than 4 million deaths per year, which is equivalent to about 8% of global deaths. And this map are showing deaths due to fine particulate matter. So we'll learn a little bit more about this in a few slides, but fine particulate matter are small particles that make up some sources of air pollution. And we see hot spots around the world. Again, this is due to overall air pollution, so thinking about sources from traffic and industry, for example. And we see that Asia is particularly hard hit by severe air pollution. In those dark red shades, you see more deaths are occurring in places like China and India. So how is air pollution contributing to global mortality? Well, air pollution has broad impacts on our cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Most deaths that studies have linked air pollution to are with cardiovascular disease. That's about 1/3. Then chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, lower respiratory infections, as well as lung cancer. And we also see that these are increasing over time. But this plot is showing the mortality impacts of air pollution, but there are also other types of health effects that we can consider as well. People with asthma, for example, are highly susceptible to severe air pollution events. So now let's get into how wildfire pollution compares to general air pollution risks that we saw on the past few slides. So wildfire smoke contains both gaseous pollutants, so you may have heard of ozone or carbon monoxide as gases that we regulate against as being dangerous air pollutants. But another big contributor are these small particles. And the smaller the particle, the more dangerous they are because they can penetrate deeper into your lungs and into the bloodstream. What this image is showing are just giving you a comparison of the width of a human hair or a fine grain of sand and how much smaller these particles are to really give you a sense of what we're talking about. And it's important here, as we learned in the previous lecture looking at extreme heat, that there are going to be certain groups who are more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution. This includes people with pre-existing conditions like asthma, older adults, children, pregnant women, people who work outdoors, and also people of lower socioeconomic status who might not have access to various adaptation measures. But wildfire pollution also has some differences that we need to consider. First, there are different ways that smoke from wildfires is transported in the atmosphere, and this can influence our exposure to pollution. Smoke can travel for hundreds or even thousands of miles from the source. Second, depending on the length of fire events, we also need to consider differences between peak but very short-term exposures versus more low-level but chronic exposures, because that's all going to influence various health outcomes. And third, we need more information on the composition of particles themselves and the size. So how do particles from wildfires compare to particles that come out of the tailpipe of a car? And what does this mean for health? So a lot of these questions are all an area of active research for people around the world. But what do we know? Well, taken together, it's been estimated that air pollution from fires causes 340,000 deaths per year, and this is due to pollution exposure. But as we learned in the last section, there's going to be substantial variability because we know that wildfire activity isn't going to be constant from year to year. And I want to reiterate again that while this plot is showing mortality effects, so that's very serious looking at the number of deaths per year, wildfire particulate matter also contributes to asthma attacks, adverse birth outcomes when pregnant women are exposed to wildfire pollution, and other conditions like bronchitis and pneumonia. And finally, let's take a look into the future. So recent studies suggest that the impact of wildfires on air pollution is going to increase with future climate. The gray bars are showing that air pollution from other sources will likely decrease going forward in the next few decades, but pollution from wildfires is going to increase. And the study that I pulled this figure from looked across the US. But for those of us who live here in California, unfortunately, they found that the western US is going to be highly susceptible to wildfire pollution increases going forward in the future. Okay, so now that we have some background on what is driving wildfire activity and how this influences public health, let's now turn to our case study in Indonesia. And the purpose of this case study is to give you all a sense of an applied example of what we've learned so far. So let me start with a little bit of context for why we're looking at wildfire pollution in Indonesia. So a couple of years ago, in the fall of 2015, Indonesia experienced an intense fire event that spread smoke not just across Indonesia, but across much of the region in equatorial Asia. The emissions from just the fire season were on par with annual fossil fuel emissions from several countries. And I have up here a sample of headlines that I pulled from during the event. And so you can see just how disruptive this event was across the region. It caused a political rift between Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. And at one point, the pollution from the fires was so bad that the Indonesian government started evacuating infants and mothers from the worst affected areas. And Singapore was closing schools and canceling various events. So as these news articles hinted at, Indonesia is one of these global fire hotspots. On average, Indonesia's fire emissions are about 10% of global fire emissions. But there's a lot of variability. And in high fire years, Indonesia's contribution to global fire emissions can reach closer to 40%. So over the next few slides, we're going to learn a little bit about what causes these changes in fire emissions. But one important concept that I want to introduce here is fuel load. So we talked about this before, thinking about the difference between grasslands and forests. Grasslands are less fuel, so lower emissions, and forests are higher fuel loads, so more emissions. Well, Indonesia has not just forests, but peat swamp forests. So that means above ground, you have forests with their high fuel loads, and then below ground, you have even more fuel in the form of peat swamps. But before we get into these fuel loads, I also want to provide a little bit more detail on this variability in Indonesia's fire activity, because this will also have important implications when we're thinking about fire pollution and human health. So this plot is comparing fire emissions in Indonesia, that's on the left-hand side, with country-level fossil fuel emissions, so annual country-level fossil fuel emissions. So we see here the dramatic swings in fire activity from year to year, and also in the magnitude. In 1997, for example, Indonesia's fire emissions, and this occurred over the course of a few months, were comparable to all of the fossil fuel emissions for the European Union over a year. The recent 2015 fire event that we saw those news articles from, the fire emissions were comparable to India and Japan's annual fossil fuel emissions. And there are several years that you see here with that bottom dotted line where Indonesia's fire emissions are higher than the fossil fuel emissions that India burns as a country. So now let's focus on what is driving these severe fires in Indonesia. This image is showing a satellite detection of pollution from fires occurring in Indonesia. So Indonesia is right under that hotspot of pollution and spreading across the region. And so you see here that it's truly not a local issue. Wildfire pollution becomes this regional issue. And in the next few slides, we're going to discuss the three main drivers of wildfires: climate, fuel loads, and land use, or human activities. Now, a critical takeaway from this climate piece is that there is a non-linear relationship between drought and fire activity. So what we see here on the x-axis, we have rainfall. As rainfall declines, we see a huge upswing in wildfire activity. So this means that when there's slight changes in droughts, we're going to really increase our risk of wildfire activity. In Indonesia, El Nino brings drought conditions, and this has most notably happened, if you remember from a few slides back, in 1997, 2006, and 2015. But another consideration that a lot of folks are working on research right now is how longer-term trends in climate could alter these relationships as well. Our second driver of wildfire activity are fuel loads, or peatlands. So peatlands are partially decomposed organic matter that store large amounts of fuel below ground. If you were to leave peatlands alone for thousands of years, they would become coal. So that gives you a sense of just how much fuel is there. And Indonesia alone has about 15 million hectares of peatlands. And peatlands don't normally burn because they are a swamp-like ecosystem. So there is a high water table that is protecting them from wildfires. But they become highly susceptible to fires following land use change. So what we see here in this picture didn't come out great, but what you look at in the middle is an example of a peat swamp forest where the trees have been cleared and they're in the process of draining off the swamp so that they can then convert these lands to agriculture. And another key point is that once fires start in peatlands, they're extremely difficult to extinguish, so they can burn out of control for a long time. And the final driver that we'll consider is the influence of land use and human activities. In Indonesia, forests are cleared for agriculture, often using fires, not always, but often. And the area that has been cleared by deforestation is immense. Forests and peatlands the size of the United Kingdom have been cleared in Indonesia since 1990. And what is this going for? So most of the deforestation is for agriculture and plantations. In this part of the world, one of the biggest agricultural industries, we have oil palm, as well as pulpwood for paper products and timber. So now let's move into what this means for health. And when we think about health, I want to reiterate again that this is not just a local issue for communities that live close to where wildfires occur, but it's a true regional issue. In Indonesia, the fire pollution does not just affect the communities that are living close to where the fires are lit, or just the country of Indonesia, but it really becomes an issue across their neighboring countries as well. Now, some previous work has quantified just how serious these public health risks from wildfire pollution in Indonesia is. For example, the 2015 fires, which we saw were an extreme fire event, not as extreme as the 1997 fires, but these caused 100,000 deaths around the region and exposed nearly 70 million people to unhealthy levels of air quality. And again, these health impacts are going to be the most severe for vulnerable parts of our population. That includes babies and young children, as well as the elderly. So to think about a more positive note, what can we do about this? Given that there are these serious impacts of fires on public health, what can we do to reduce the effects in the future? So what I wanted to share here are just 2 slides from my own research that has looked at strategies to reduce fires associated with different types of land use in Indonesia. And what we did here is we created a publicly available online tool for anyone to use that helps policymakers and decision makers in Indonesia strategize how to reduce the public health impacts of fires. So there's a lot of detail here. This is just a screenshot from our tool that we built with Google. There's something called Google Earth Engine. But the key takeaways are that the tool integrates this information on the drivers of fire activity, climate, land use, and fuel loads, and then automatically calculates how changing one of these strategies would then impact your public health outcomes. So the panels on the left allow a user of the online tool to modify these different drivers, and then the tool will automatically update on the right, and they can see how many lives would be saved by decisions that they make on the ground. And finally, I want to share a more applied example of how this tool works. We worked as part of this study with an Indonesian government agency called the Peatlands Restoration Agency. They're also known as BRG. So they're responsible for restoring vast areas of peatlands around Indonesia. And you can see from the boxes we have here in the black squares, these are all of the areas that they've proposed as sites that they want to focus on for restoring land and blocking fires. And so what we did is we worked with them and using this online tool to calculate the top areas that they could focus on that would have the most benefit on public health. And so those are the areas shown in blue. So by using this tool, this government agency could use their limited resources more effectively to protect health. So to wrap up with our case study from Indonesia, there are several interacting factors that are driving severe fires in the country. We think about climate, fuel loads, and land use. And while we have some specifics here in Indonesia that we consider, those three drivers are what we think of around the world, but each are going to play a slightly different role. And second, it's important to think about how these different factors interact. And by integrating these different drivers, then we can really maximize public health benefits from various decisions that people make to reduce fires. Okay, so now I want to wrap up with just a brief overview about what we learned, and then finally, let's conclude with thinking about what this means for us here in California. So first, wildfire smoke emits gases and particles, and these are dangerous air pollutants that we know from decades of research in other contexts. And what we're particularly concerned about is the effect that pollution has on cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Conditions that are conducive for burning to occur, hot and dry weather, typically occur on a seasonal basis, but there are going to be variations in the severity of those conditions from year to year. But over the long term, we are already seeing evidence of longer fire seasons, although this varies depending on what part of the world you're looking at. And we're also seeing how climate change is increasing wildfires, particularly here in the Western US. There's been a lot of research focused on our situation here. So, and then when we're thinking about the human influence, it's both how humans contribute to global climate change, which can be increasing our baseline risk of fires. But humans are also responsible for ignition, whether this was intentional or accidental, and suppression. And this can change wildfire risk in the long term as well. And as people move, more and more people are in the wildland-urban interface close to where fires occur. There are more people and more communities who are at risk of wildfires. Our case study in Indonesia shows how wildfire pollution and health can be thought of as part of an integrated system that ties together both the drivers of wildfires and the impact on health. And these multiple factors are all occurring together. And by thinking about how these factors connect and interact, we can use this to help reduce the public health risks. And finally, to wrap up, in my last couple of slides, I'd like to end with what this means for us in California. So as we saw from a figure earlier in my talk, wildfires have been increasing in California over the past several decades. And studies have shown that anthropogenic climate change has driven a large part of this increase. So this is an urgent threat for people who live close to where the wildfires occur, known as the wildland-urban interface. But again, it's not just the people close by. We see in this image that was taken from the Camp Fire in Northern California, the impact of air pollution becomes a regional issue. We see the smoke from the fires across the Bay Area. Looking closer to home, this is a satellite image taken from right before and after the Thomas Fire in late 2017 in the Ventura area. So here's our first image taken right before the fires, and then after. So you just see how much land area was affected. We're looking at the communities of Ventura, Ojai, and Santa Barbara. So wildfires are already having a serious impact on public health here in California through air pollution. This is a satellite image that was taken when the Camp Fire was burning in Northern California and the Woolsey and Hill fires were burning down here in Southern California. So millions of California residents were exposed to unhealthy levels of air quality from smoke from these fires. There were air quality alerts, canceled schools, canceled events. There are more than 10,000 students in Santa Monica and Malibu who stayed home during the fires, both because of the immediate threat and also because of the smoke. This is showing some analysis of air pollution stations done by the Sacramento Bee. And they found that there were large increases in air pollution during these events. If you look at the bottom, we have anywhere from 20 to more than 50 times higher air pollution measurements from when the fires were occurring compared to right before. And there are several actions that can be taken. You can stay indoors as much as possible during wildfire events and keep track of the information that's provided on air quality so that you know what the risks are. And finally, I think it's important to think about future trends. This is showing wildfire burned area in California since the mid-1970s. We see the variability, but we also see this increasing trend. And what scientists and engineers are working on now is trying to understand what this means for our future wildfire activity and our risk then. So what can we do to protect our health? First is understanding our wildfire risk, how this varies in different locations and how this could change in the future. Second is considering how fire risk can be included in land use planning, in development decisions that make vegetation fire breaks and use fire-resistant materials in buildings. And third, communities can work together on preparedness plans so that we can help to make sure the most vulnerable people in our population, people who might not have the ability to evacuate, that we know where they're located and we know how to get to them. And then here's some advice from the California Air Resources Board up in Sacramento. To think about protections from wildfire smoke, I think, first of all, it's important to have information and education that we can use to inform our decisions and possible behavioral changes. Their key takeaways are that you should focus on checking the air quality so you know what your risk is, staying indoors and closing windows and doors so that your indoor air quality stays as clean as possible. When appropriate, getting a mask that can filter out those particles in the air, and avoiding outdoor activities when the wildfire pollution is at its worst. So with that, I'd like to leave you with 3 key takeaways from thinking about this connection between wildfires and public health. So first, wildfire smoke contains dangerous air pollutants. This includes both gases like ozone, but more importantly, these small particles that are really dangerous to human health. Second, wildfire activity is changing around the world. We've already seen evidence of some of these changes, and we're trying to build new models and new tools to predict how this can change more in the future. And finally, to reduce these negative health outcomes from wildfires, we can focus both on reducing fire risk at the source, but also on implementing protective measures so that if wildfires do occur, our communities are better prepared. So with that, thank you for your time and staying so late on a Wednesday, and I'll happily take any questions.
You and I will have to share this microphone. So if you look at the various sources of air pollution in the state of California, realizing there are regional differences and so on, but if you transportation, electricity generation, those seem to be probably going to be going down in the future. Where do fires rank in that? Is it becoming the major source of air pollution?
It is. Sorry. It is. And, you know, I just started at UCLA, go Bruins, and so I will be focusing more on wildfires here in California. I've done more work thinking in tropical countries. So I don't know the statistics off the top of my head yet, but wildfires are becoming a major threat, especially when we think about the seasons when they occur. So in the summer, we traditionally have forest fires in the Sierras and different mountainous areas. And then down here, most people are probably familiar with the Santa Ana events when we get those hot, dry winds in the fall. And that can be really dangerous for fire conditions in some of the coastal shrubs as well as forests that we have here.
Okay, do we have, Francis, I knew I could count on you.
Oh, wow, what an amazing amount of information. What an amazing amount of information you shared with us. I took copious notes. My background is nursing, so as we know, aloe vera helps decrease scars from severe burns of human beings. I was looking at the catastrophic effect that it had on the fires having burn scars. What is being done or planned to reverse the burn scars? And also you mentioned about smoke transport. I know there's no such thing as filters and fans in the sky, but there should be something to be able to help move the smoke. So is anything being done or planned? Thank you.
Yeah, so the first part of your question was, if I am understanding correctly, what is happening for the burn scars we see on the ground? What are we doing for the vegetation? So it depends on where you are. If you're looking in one of the areas where ecosystems are naturally adapted to some low-level burning, there's some types of forests and some shrubs here in Southern California that actually low-level burning will help open up seeds and sprout new vegetation. So in some of these ecosystems, they will naturally regenerate after a fire. But then in other parts of the world where fire is not part of the ecosystem, there are active management plans. So our case study in Indonesia, for example, what that government agency is doing is in some of these areas that have been decimated by fires, and then agriculture is gone. Some agriculture has happened in some of these areas, but in other parts, it's just burned scars on the land. They are reflooding the peat swamps and planting new vegetation so that it comes back. And then the second part of your question was looking about smoke transport in the atmosphere. And so I think one of the big things that people are doing now is trying to get a better handle on the modeling side so that we can understand where exactly that smoke is going in the atmosphere so that we know who's exposed to the pollution. And there's different categories of models that people are using, both to think long-term, but also what can we do so that if a fire is burning today, we know where that pollution's gonna go and we can forecast where it's going to go in the future so that we can prepare communities. Because if there's communities surrounding a fire, you need to know, is the smoke gonna go to the people living to the east, to the north, to the south? And then that way we can get the communities better prepared.
When did PhD professors get to be so young?
You are kind, because I just had a baby, so I'm not feeling super young, but.
The full wording of climate change is human-induced climate change. And you got 150 years ago, the intrepid explorer John Wesley Powell, one-armed Civil War hero, comes down the Colorado River and he writes a series of papers for the Interior Department talking about there'll never be large populations in the West because there's not enough resources. The population of the country then was 40 million. So you can see the weighting of population. People are living in areas they shouldn't live in. It all comes back to sheer numbers. And I'd like to see a little bit more of that as background information.
Okay.
Because it's not just climate change, it's human. Yeah. This is not natural climate change, human-induced climate change.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point and something that it's really important to take into consideration. So there's both anthropogenic climate change, and there's some studies that are showing how climate change is responsible for hotter and drier conditions and what that means for baseline wildfire risk, because we're not going to have a wildfire when it's raining. But in addition to that, and so that can be, you can think about that at a broader scale with how climate change is affecting wildfire risk, but it's also the human ignition and the human suppression. And so as more and more people are living close to where these fires occur, and if there's more, a spark from a tailpipe can ignite a wildfire. There can be, as we know, with some of the electrical equipment. And so it's that interplay between climate and also direct human influence on wildfires that I think is really important.
Do we have another one?
Yeah. Okay.
I was curious because your map of the fires from last year didn't include the fires that were in Siberia or in the Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
And those were not from, as far as anybody knows, I haven't seen that was spillover or encroachment from people.
Mm-hmm.
They were sort of spontaneously ignited, I suppose, from the heat and the fuel that was there. So not all of it is human-driven. There's some of it is climate-driven.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for mitigating that, there's these efforts in various locations worldwide to reforest. What do you think that would be? I've lived in this area for 50 years. I've seen all of the fires in our hills here, from the Bel Air fire on up. And I remember younger, these foothills had a lot more trees on them, but all the fires that have burned, every single one of these foothills have burned in my lifetime, and we don't replant. So what is your take on it? You're, as a scientist, for reforesting and getting rivers to return and things like that. How will that help, or is that just fantasy?
Okay, so that's a great question. And I would say the really key takeaway on that is that there isn't going to be one solution that works everywhere. And so you really need to bring in ecologists and an interdisciplinary team of scientists who can think about the implications of reforesting, because what works in Indonesia, where we're thinking about re-wetting these peat swamps and replanting forests there, is not going to be, not everything from that context is going to be relevant here in Southern California. So I would say that my advice when you're thinking about reforesting and in different parts of the world is you really need to consider the local context, both what's happened in the past and then what we think might happen in the future. And that's where bringing together all of these different information sources, like models and satellite data and on-the-ground studies, using all of the available information is really helpful. Yeah.
So you can ask a question of either of our two speakers, but that was a good lead into, because that's one of the things that Arizona State University decided to do, to mix up all the disciplines.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the faculty didn't like that at all, because they were more comfortable within their homes. Are you comfortable?
I don't know. This might be on.
You have that.
Is this one on?
Can we put her level there?
Yeah, I think it's on. Okay. Yeah, so ASU is really trying to push the boundaries and plopping people of very different disciplines right beside each other and see what they come up with, essentially. And like I said, I'm surrounded by a lot of different types of scientists in my department, but I think the one school at ASU that really pushes this boundary is called the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. And you're like, what is that? But you can have someone who studies space right beside someone who's studying social ties in vulnerable populations, and you never know what their next conversation at the water cooler will result in. And I think that that's the way President Crow is thinking, and why we push innovation so much.
And I think you haven't been at UCLA very long, but the Institute for the Environment and Sustainability, that was created to bring departments together within the Institute. Is it happening?
Definitely. So I'm at the School of Public Health at UCLA in our Environmental Health Sciences department, but I'm also affiliated with the Institute of the Environment. And so this environment and sustainability, it used to just be environment. And the purpose of this institute is to bring together faculty and researchers and students from across UCLA and thinking about humanities and social science as well as engineering and science, and bringing everyone together to be thinking about these cross-disciplinary projects and how students who are interested in taking classes across departments, bringing that all together under a common program.
And we've talked about it here before. These are all what are called wicked problems. They don't belong to any discipline. You can't solve them. But if you formulate them properly, you can manage them to keep them within bounds. Or you work at Duran Corporation. They have this favorite phrase, you manage them to minimize regret. And that may seem like a low bar, but it's actually a very, very high bar. How about join me in thanking our two speakers for a great, great talk this evening. You really were terrific.
Thank you for the advice.
And remember, next week we will be streaming live. The speakers will be streaming from somewhere else. You can come here and watch it on the big screen with me, or you can watch it at home on your computers. But thank you for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you in one way or another next week.
That was awesome.